Welcome back, everyone. I'm Stephanie Valinsky, the Commission's Deputy Director. Our next session is going to focus on vicarious trauma. Attorneys recognize that stressors are a part of the job, but there's much less discussion and recognition of trauma. So our goal is to change that. Michael Rourke, a career prosecutor and the elected district attorney in Weld County, Colorado, will first share his story of how vicarious trauma impacted him both personally and professionally. Then I will be joined by both Michael and Ellie Feldman, a licensed clinical professional counselor, for a discussion on how lawyers can recognize and address vicarious trauma throughout their careers. Please help me welcome District Attorney Michael Rourke to the stage.
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I wanted to share with you all a TED Talk that I was able to and honored to give as part of a TEDx Mile High event back in June of 2023. And it was really the first opportunity that I had to share in any kind of a public way my own personal and professional experiences with the topic of vicarious trauma. And so I want to be able to jump right into that, and then I'll be honored to answer any questions that you all may have as we work our way into that town hall that Stephanie talked about. So thank you for having me. When I say prosecutor, what phrases immediately come to mind? Tough on crime, aggressive, overbearing and rigid in appearance. Ask my wife and she might jump right to arrogant. Now, I'll admit that these stereotypes aren't probably too far off base, but I want to let you in on a little secret. That's exactly what we were taught, to confidently stride into that courtroom and have a tough, hardened exterior, because that is exactly what our community expects. Now, we as prosecutors are honored to stand before judges and juries every day, advocating for those who have been injured or killed. And I've accepted that persona, being the voice for the voiceless, and its accompanying expectations, entering courtrooms carrying the weight of someone else's trauma more times than I can count. The murder victim's family, the sexual assault survivor, the small child victimized in ways we cannot understand. But not once in law school or in the early days of my career did anyone tell me that this job might have an impact on me too. I remember as a very young lawyer, the first time I was asked to attend an autopsy. The victim was an 11-year-old boy who had been strangled to death, placed in a duffel bag, and thrown into a construction dumpster in the middle of January. When he was found, he was frozen solid. No one should be victimized in that way. And no one should ever have to experience what I saw and what I heard and what I smelled that day. I could only take a few minutes in the autopsy room, before I had to excuse myself for my own sanity. Rather than being met with sympathy, I was teased, I was handed a stick of gum, and I was told, get back in there. The best way to deal with it was to simply get back to work. So I did. For another 27 years on crimes against children, homicides, domestic violence, and sexual assaults. I rose through the ranks from that brand new deputy district attorney to district attorney. And I watched as passionate legal professionals burned out, quit, self-medicated with alcohol, but I didn't stop and think much about why. Then in 2018, my wife and a very close friend of hers invited a well-known television journalist from Denver named Anastasia Bolton onto their podcast as a guest. She talked about her coverage of numerous tragedies in Colorado, including the Aurora theater shooting, and how they had impacted her and her camera person. It made absolute sense to me as she spoke about how they too were there, hearing the sounds, smelling the smells, seeing the faces of the first responders. She called it vicarious trauma, the emotional residue of exposure to traumatic stories and witnessing the fear, pain, and terror others have experienced. Some people call it the cost of caring. I'd heard that term before regarding our military, our first responders, the notion of trauma. Law enforcement, fire, emergency medical professionals. Yet still, I had no recognition at that time that vicarious trauma could impact me. It's just part of our job, right? August 2018, Frederick, Colorado. A man whose name will not come out of my mouth stood in front of television cameras, feigned concern, and lied to the public, claiming he needed information about the whereabouts of his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. But something was off, and within just a few days, we learned that it was all a calculated charade by a monster who had annihilated his family. He had murdered his wife, his 4-year-old daughter, and his 3-year-old daughter. He buried his wife and their unborn son in a shallow grave near an oil tank battery, a series of oil tanks. He smothered his daughters with his own hands and placed him in those oil tanks, each through an 8-inch diameter hatch at the top of those tanks. Not the same tank, different tanks, thereby assuring that they would be alone in death. Once again, my partners and I readied ourselves to step into that courtroom and speak for the innocent, to be the voices for that young pregnant mother and her 2 daughters. We were going to get justice for her killer. As the district attorney, I had a team of lawyers and investigators working for me, and I let them take the lead early in the investigation. And for my own sanity, I refused to look at the crime scene evidence, the crime scene photographs. Back in 2018, Colorado still had the death penalty, and I knew if I was going to have to consider seeking the ultimate punishment, I had to see for myself firsthand what he had done. So one night that fall, sitting across the couch from my wife, I opened my laptop to examine the photographic evidence documenting the recovery of those little girls' bodies from the oil tanks by a hazardous materials crew. What I saw were 2 little blonde girls' lifeless bodies covered in oil. And I mentioned their hair color for this simple reason. At that time, my daughter was also 3.5 years old, and she had long blonde hair. As I looked at those photos, I looked across my living room and I saw my daughter singing and dancing across the room. And something happened. I was lightheaded. I got tunnel vision. I felt like I was going to black out. I felt like I was going to throw up. My wife watched as a very dark shadow was cast over my face, and it had finally happened. All of the evil, all of the trauma, all of the pain that I had seen finally spilled over. That was the moment that I realized this job had changed me forever. Where I live in Weld County, Colorado, we have a very robust oil and gas industry, and you can't hardly drive down a county road without seeing a cluster of those oil tanks. And to this day, more than 7 years later, every time I drive by one of those oil tanks, I see those little girls and I see my own daughter. My mind goes back to that very dark place I found myself during 2018, and I'm filled with rage for what those victims endured. Vicarious trauma is real, not just for prosecutors. It is a daily reality for legal secretaries, victim advocates, investigators, our attorneys, and supervisors. That case changed all of us. It made me realize that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. Instead, we as criminal justice professionals must proactively take care of ourselves and each other. That old narrative that I talked about the tough, aggressive prosecutor who ignores his or her own mental health for sake of the job is being crumpled up and thrown out like the trash that it is. Because the Frederick case isn't some outlier or anomaly. Criminal justice professionals see the worst that humans can do to one another on a daily basis. And when I think back to what I wish I had as a young prosecutor, it was for a culture which gave me the permission, when I was having a bad day, to walk over to someone that I trusted in the office, shut the door, and tell them everything that was going through my mind. So in light of the case that I've discussed, we decided to do just that. We created a peer support system for our deputy district attorneys, investigators, victim advocates, and administrative professionals here in Weld County, Colorado. Under the guidance of a former law enforcement officer and trained counselor, we recruited volunteers for a rigorous training program to become a peer support team member. This team, made up of our own employees, are not trained to provide professional mental health counseling, but to be an immediate resource, to simply lend an ear to a colleague who needs to talk about their own thoughts and feelings. No appointment is necessary, and no time is taken off of work. It's as simple as a phone call or an email to say, "Can I talk to you in your capacity as a peer support team member?" We then set up an office in a quiet corner of our building, complete with comfortable chairs, resource handouts, and a welcoming atmosphere. But it's not just our office. We're part of a nationwide movement of prosecutors challenging the notion of vicarious trauma head-on. Back in 2019, the National District Attorneys Association recognized this need, and I was fortunate enough to be invited as a founding member of the Wellbeing Task Force. And for those of you paying attention online this afternoon, that's the WTF. We as leaders in the prosecution community came together and said enough is enough. We are tired of losing passionate criminal justice professionals to burnout, addiction, suicide. We had to shift the old narrative away from it's just part of the job to we can do better for each other. Already, that Wellbeing Task Force has published hundreds of articles and blogs for lawyers to teach them what vicarious trauma is, how it affects you and your coworkers, and how to get support. We launched a well-being app, and a couple of years ago, the task force hosted its first annual well-being retreat. And no, it was not just yoga and meditation. More than a decade ago, the sexual assault investigation community created a program called Start by Believing, because we know that if a victim feels supported and believed during their initial outcry, it can make a profound difference in their life. I now get to teach the next generation of prosecutors that as district attorney, that I have found that this same philosophy applies to criminal justice professionals dealing with trauma. We now teach them saying, I need help is welcomed. And the response that they should expect is not just get back to work. It's, I believe you. What can I do to support you? This is not simply change for change's sake, but an institutional reckoning, a generational shift which says we must be better. We must embrace these truths that vicarious trauma is real and that we must help one another. Caring for you, our communities, starts with caring for ourselves. To stand up and be the voice of the voiceless, we must be a better version of ourselves. Even this rigid career prosecutor finally asked for help. You can too, and it will make all the difference. Thank you.